Welcome back to the Autistic Tidbits and Tangents podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Cara Diamond. I'm an autistic teacher, university lecturer, and author from Toronto, Ontario, Canada.
And hi, I am Bruce Petherick. I am the autistic advocate for Autism Canada, but maybe more often I am an autistic musician, and I am in Vancouver, Canada.
And we're really excited because we've been having so many conversations about autistic creativity this season. And we have J.D. Barker with us, who is an international best-selling American author whose work has been broadly described as suspense thrillers, often incorporating elements of horror, crime, mystery, science fiction, and the supernatural. And his first book, Forsaken, he wrote in 2012. He actually had Stephen King read portions of it and received permission to use one of Stephen King's characters, Leland Gaunt, in the novel, which must have been just an incredible experience to talk to someone like that as someone, venturing into book writing. How was that for you, JD?
Well, pleasure to be here. So that was a crazy experience. So with that book, anybody who's ever written a book, it's all about getting that last page on paper. And in the story, I had to explain where the wife buys a journal. So just to get the book done, I wrote that she walked into Needful Things, Stephen King's store, and bought it there, and fully expected to have to change that because you can't just do that sort of thing without a bunch of lawyers, knocking on your door.
Yeah.
But my wife read it and she said, I like this. Let's see if we can get King's permission to use it. So it turns out we were in Florida. My mom's got a house that's maybe 10 minutes from King's house. So we literally printed up the manuscript, hopped in the car, and figured we'd head on over. And, my autistic brain is thinking, well, he'll be outside gardening. We'll just show him the manuscript. He'll give us a thumbs up and we'll be on our way. It didn't work out that way. King lives on Casey Key, which is basically an island right off the coast. There's a little bridge that takes you over. And if you make a left-hand turn, you go to the public portion of the island, where the restaurants and bars and things like that are. And if you make a right, you basically hit the entire half of the island that King owns. There's immediately a no trespassing sign, a private drive sign. You get about a half mile in and there's a gate, and then was another gate. So I got to the point where I was looking up in the trees, expecting to see a sniper.
Yeah, right.
So we turned around, went to a restaurant, and I called a friend of mine, a guy named Jack Ketchum. His real name was Dallas Mary. He passed away a few years ago. But he knew King, and I told him what we were doing, and he said, "Oh yeah, don't stalk Steve. He hates that. Here's his email address. Just send him the book. If he likes it, you'll hear back from him. If the book is garbage, then he probably won't reply." So I did that. And a couple of days later, I got an email back from King, and he basically gave me his blessing. He said, "I love the book. Go ahead and use what you need, and let me know if you need anything." I stared at that for probably 2 or 3 days, expecting a retraction. I meant that for Grisham, not you.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
he never did, and he held to his word. And all these years later, it's basically what sparked my career.
That's incredible. Oh my gosh. So we're going to be talking about all things creativity, the autistic creative process, some of the other highlights of your career, JD, and we're going to roll the credits.
Welcome to Autistic Tidbits and Tangents.
Candid conversations between autistic off-hour professionals.
With lots of tangents in different accents.
Cool.
Trigger warnings for this episode we could not identify. Let us know if we missed anything.
I want to pick on something, JD, you've just shared about Stephen King. He seems such a what's the word? Lack of diva. There doesn't seem to be too much pretension about him in person. Is that true?
Well, I've never met him in person. I've never even spoken to him on the phone, but we've exchanged a lot of emails over the years. I think, most writers tend to come from very humble beginnings. Stephen King wrote Carrie, his first novel, one of those little school desks wedged between a washer and dryer and a trailer. When you come from that, you remember it. For me, I've been writing professionally for 10 years, but like I remember the first day, I sold that first novel. Like those things stick in your head. And then, the wonder of whether or not the next novel is going to sell is always right there knocking on the door. I don't think regardless of how famous an author gets, that ever goes away. I've written 5 books with James Patterson, and, he came from literally nothing. And he has never forgotten that. I mean, the guy has built $1 billion empire. He's one of the biggest sellers in the world, but he's probably the most humble person I've ever spoken to. I think a lot of us, on the author side, we tend to remember that, and we all try to help out whoever is coming next. I mean, I bend over backwards to help new authors to try and get them noticed, and we just all kind of pay it forward in whatever way we can.
I have said to people in the past that that's exactly my experience when I've worked with quite a number of like A-list musicians, like top, and maybe they're a little more a diva than writers. I think there's a little more performative aspect about that, and that's okay. But the best musicians I ever worked with have been professionally humble, but so supportive, and also so they've recognized that their life is different, somewhat special, and things need to be done to make their life, comfortable. They're touring around the world and whatever. But they're also gracious about it. It's the people below the A-list that I've always had the problem with. The ones who are not quite there, they're the ones that seem to be a bit more of a jerk. And again, I think it's a lot more obvious in the performative arts just because, you need to show.
That's for sure. Now, so I'm so curious, from your first book to now, like how has your life changed, would you say?
Oh, it's been a crazy roller coaster ride. So prior to writing that first book, I was a chief compliance officer at a brokerage firm, which is as horrible as it sounds.
Yes, sounds
but
pretty deadly.
It paid really well. Yeah. So I was kind of stuck. We had the big house, we had the cars, we had a boat. We had the trappings of that particular lifestyle.
Yeah.
But my wife knew I wanted to be a full-time writer, so I had been working as a ghostwriter and a book doctor. And over 20 some years, I had 6 different books that hit the New York Times list, all with other people's names on the cover. And when that 6th one hit, that was kind of the catalyst. And she pulled me aside and she came up with this crazy plan. We sold literally everything that we owned. We bought a duplex in Pittsburgh, moved it to one side and rented out the other, and lived off of savings long enough for me to write that first book. I
got misty-eyed. Like I'm tearing up because I think that's such a beautiful show of support and a brilliant leap of faith. And ghostwriting that many books that got to that list without your name, that just like my injustice sensitivity gets really triggered by that.
Well, the thing was, though, as an autistic person, the job that I had, that was everything for me is based on patterns. Yeah. So I had done that job for a very long time. So breaking away from that pattern and doing something as drastic as what we did, I never would have been able to do that without my wife, pulling the trigger and twisting my arm. I would terrifying. Still be working that desk job today.
It's so hard to get out of our comfort zone and do something that we don't know for certain what the outcome will be.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you explain exactly what a ghostwriter and a book doctor is, please?
Sure. So I actually started off in the music business years back. I worked for RCA Records and BMG Distribution, and I would pick up recording artists when they came into the Fort Lauderdale, Miami area. I'd pick them up at the airport. I have to get them to the radio stations to do their interviews, get them to their concert, and eventually get them back on the airplane. And I used to interview those people in the car, and that's basically how I got my start. I would interview them, and then I would turn around and sell those interviews. When you start working for newspapers and magazines, literally everybody you encounter has a novel at some stage of development in a desk drawer somewhere. It's 500,000 words long. They've been working on it for 10 years. It's almost done, but it needs a little something. I was very good with grammar and punctuation and that sort of thing and story development. So those people would hand off those books to me, and I would basically go through them, figure out what needed to be changed. And over time, that became a career as a book doctor, where I basically did that professionally behind the scenes, like worked a corporate job during the daytime, and I would come home and work on books to keep myself sane. So, in some cases, as word spread that I was doing this, I would get a phone call, let's say, from an agent who had a book that, he or she absolutely loved, but it needed a little something, and they tried to get the author to fix it. And a lot of times it's, trim the length down, take 20,000 words out, get rid of this character, combine these people. But the author is just was too close to the story to pull that off, especially, on a first novel. So they would bring me in as a hired gun to do that. And then they would turn around and sell that book. And later it became editors that would contact me. And what I got out of that is, as an author, if an editor calls you and there's a problem with your book, they tend to sugarcoat everything. So they'll tell you 5 things that are great about the book, then they'll sneak in that one negative thing, and then they'll give you 3 more positive things before they hang up that phone. That's kind of how it works on the author side. But as a book doctor, they didn't sugarcoat anything. They would pick up the phone and they would tell me, listen, this person can't write dialogue to save their life. Their descriptions are terrible, this, and that. So over time, I basically learned what the folks in New York really wanted to see in a best-selling novel, because it was completely unfiltered. So that's what I did as a book doctor. I basically took a C-list book and turned it into an A-list book and got it ready for publication.
And like how helpful that is as an autistic person to get like the blunt feedback, even though it wasn't feedback for you specifically. Like that would absolutely help with pattern recognition, writing your own books, taking that knowledge forward.
Well, one of the reasons I was so good at it is as an autistic person, we mimic a lot. And in writing, I basically do that with the written word. So if somebody hands me a book that's written by somebody else, if I've got enough sample data there, I can mimic their written voice to the point where it's indistinguishable from their voice, their cadence, their vocabulary. So that's where it really became useful, because I don't know of anybody else in this industry that is able to do that. I wrote a prequel to Dracula for Bram Stoker's family, and I used Bram's original notes. And like I can go through that book today and I can't tell you what parts Bram wrote versus what I wrote, because it's literally the same style.
First of all, that must have been so incredible. What was it like holding original notes and like journals and things like that?
That was such a surreal experience for me. The second day of the project, my wife and I had gone to visit Dacre Stoker, who's Bram's great grandnephew, at a cabin that he had in the Carolinas, and he disappeared for a couple minutes and came back with this trunk and set it on the kitchen table, and it was literally everything Bram had on his desk when he wrote the original novel. There were notes written on laundry receipts, on scraps of paper. Parts of the novel were plotted out in a day timer, which took me by surprise at first. But then I remember that Bram used to be a theater manager, so that type of structure was, something he did daily. And if you think about the structure of a novel, when you say Mina did this at 2:00, at 3:00 she did this, it's literally, a day timer plots out that outline for you.
Awesome.
So yeah, I mean, Dracula is one of those books I read as a kid, and I've read it a million times since then, and it always takes on different meaning for me, as I get older. But it was a dream project.
Yeah. And I know, so growing up, you read a lot of horror. I know you read the Hardy Boys. What was there any point or any particular book that made you think, I want to do that?
I think to a certain extent they all did. We didn't have a television in the house. We read all the time. So I was buried in books, and the fact that you could basically create an entire world. You could create people, circumstances, everything between the covers of a book. That's the part that really grabbed me. You can create anything that you want inside of a book. And I remember writing at a very young age. My sister is 15 months younger than me, and I used to write stories and staple them together, and she would come into my fake library and check them out, and I would charge her late fees. We did that for the longest time. So, writing and reading have always been a big part of my life.
Me too. My father wrote a novel. He's never published it, but he wrote, more than one novel. But when I was about 10 or 11, he was writing it and he was giving me the chapters to read and edit for him. And I fell in love with the process of writing, of having a writer to writer relationship with my dad. And then I would go and write like Agatha Christie style novels and a science fiction novel, never finished. But same thing, where I was just so absorbed in this world. It was so vivid to me. I'm wondering, all we can do is speculate, because all three of us are autistic, of course. Autistic creativity, is it different than neurotypical creativity? Do we have a different relationship with imagination, with the process? What do you think?
I can actually honestly answer that
Oh,
because I
cool.
work with a lot of co-authors, and as far as I know, none of them are autistic.
Yeah.
So like if you can see my desk behind me, I don't know if your listeners
Yeah.
or can see video, but like there's nothing on it other than my Mac. I'm working on 8 different books right now, all at the
Wow.
same time. So like that entire structure, the story is up here in my head.
Mhm.
The outline for what's coming next. Trying to explain that to somebody who's not autistic, like it's a very difficult thing for them to, they just can't do it.
Yeah.
And I'm grateful for that. One of the things that I got out of it is I've never had any formal training. I don't have an MFA. Other than like high school and college English, I haven't taken any particular classes on this.
Mhm.
But because I read so much, the story structure itself basically got embedded. Because as an autistic person, I recognize that pattern, and it's there. A 3-act structure in virtually every novel. And if you take one of my books, even though I didn't plot it out with a 3-act structure, it fits into one because
Yeah.
my brain, as I'm writing, I get to a certain point and it says, okay, we need to put in a twist here. This needs to happen here. And if I go a little bit beyond that without doing what should happen there, it feels almost like I took a wrong turn off the highway and I got to throw the car in reverse and back up and go back to it.
Interesting.
Which again is something that somebody that's not autistic, they don't get that because they don't see those patterns.
Yeah.
It's there for sure.
Can you explain the 3X? And I know what the answer is, but just for the listeners, and I actually have a point on that too. What's 3X?
The 3-act structure, probably if you're going to write a book, the best novel to pick up or book to pick up on the subject is called Save a Cat Writes a Book, because it gives you an actual place where you can take your story ideas and plug them in there. But 3-act structure, I'm guessing, came from plays, and I haven't had any formal training in this, so I couldn't tell you. I've been told that my books have a 3-act structure. For me, that at the end of that second act is when a major twist needs to happen, and we basically head into the climax of the story. So it's the last 20 minutes of a movie. It's the last 100 pages of a novel. It's, I see that structure there. But, if you're asking me, what specifically is the first act supposed to be about, the second act and the third act, and what are those breaks? I couldn't tell you because I've never studied it. I can tell you that in my writing, I do it subconsciously. It's there.
Actually, it comes from, it's much older. It comes actually from the theory of theses. So the 3-act process is thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. An idea, what's the counter idea, what's the twist, how do we wrap it up together? So that's very structured. That's part of what I would call, is it top down creativity? In other words, you're working structure first and working down. And I've been talking to a lot of people about autistic creativity, about how we mix. Like somebody has said, and I wish I could remember who it was, that we are all bottom-up thinkers. But I think we are a really strong combination, that we do create from bottom up, but we understand the structure from the top. What do you think about that?
No, I agree because I've got a background in computer programming, and to me, it's very similar. Like if I write the first line of code, I have to understand how it's going to impact that last line of code and everything that falls in between. If you think of the structure of a song, you've got our first verse, our second verse, the chorus, the bridge. That also has a structure to it, and I think we see that. Yeah.
I find myself like I would say when I'm writing fiction, when I'm writing poetry, things like that, I'm definitely more bottom up, and later I impose the structure. I've always been more of a stream of consciousness and then sort it out later, like make it into something afterwards. Play with conventions. Don't necessarily start with the shape in mind. One thing that I see in a lot of autistic people's work, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I find we tend to have a lot more sensory information or ways of conveying like the environmental impact on characters potentially. And I remember reading a study, I think I shared it with you at some point, Bruce, that looked sort of retrospectively diagnosing, which, may or may not be a problem. Just authors like Virginia Woolf and other people's, and looking for these T.S. Eliot, these traits of sort of conveying sensory overwhelm. Any thoughts on that?
I think that stems from the fact that those things jump out at us in real life, right? and the second I step out of my house and I'm in a strange environment, it's almost like everything gets a little bit louder, a little bit brighter, a little noisier. A lot more things there that might brush up against my arm that I may not want to.
Right.
So I think in writing, I tend to convey a lot of that information. What I've learned over time is I tend to do it more on I kind of piece it in there, but almost like on a subconscious level. I don't really think about it too much. And I try not to go overboard with it. One of the things I learned very early on in writing is even creating like a character description can be detrimental, because the second a reader sees a name or anything related to a particular character, they form an image of what that person looks like in their head. And if you wait a paragraph or two to tell them that this person has blonde hair and they've already decided that the person has brown hair, then you take them out of the story. So I tend to ignore and skip a lot of that type of information. And even with my settings, I'll seed in a couple little things here or there, but just enough to trigger that process in their own information or their own imagination. So I rely on their head basically more than my own when putting that story down on paper. But when I read reviews, a lot of people will say that my books are extremely descriptive, which to me they're not. But to somebody on the outside, it's really their own brain filling in those blanks that make it feel that way.
I love that. Bruce, you're looking pensive.
One, the amusing contrast to Murakami. Do you know Murakami, Japanese author, who's famous for being very, his narrative is very flexible, but so often in his stories, he'll suddenly just describe for like 3 pages this accurate rendition of a recipe. And it's consistent. Like he'll talk about like the character who goes to work and then comes home, and then for 3 pages, Murakami explains the spaghetti he was making, and like step by step, it's such deep detail. And then maybe the next day, the character's mother has died overnight, but that's just in passing. And so it's this kind of, he zooms into things, cooking and cats very specifically. It becomes a trend in his writing. I love the fact that you don't think you're descriptive, and I wonder if this is because we are so aware, because it's harder for us to fill in the details, that even subconsciously we may be more descriptive than we think when compared to neurotypical people. We may say things, and this is pure supposition. Maybe we describe things in a way that is more detailed at a certain level, and neurotypical people wouldn't think about that specifically, and therefore we seem to be more descriptive.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you in my world, based on what you just said, if I were to write a dinner scene, I could see myself writing out the entire process of making the spaghetti from beginning to end, and they sit down and they eat it and easily take up 4, 5, 10 pages or whatever on something like that. When I go back through the draft, a lot of times that's the stuff that gets edited out.
Yeah.
I essentially, for me to see the story play out, like I'm literally watching a movie playing in my head and I'm writing down what I see. So I have to get it all down on paper, but in the end, it doesn't all necessarily have to be there. And for me, that's come a lot from working with James Patterson, because I will turn in a scene like that to him and he'll call me up and say, is there any reason we can't just say they had spaghetti? Like 3 words. And I've written so many books with him at this point, I can almost hear the guy over my shoulder yelling at me if I type one of those scenes, if I put it all out down on paper, so exactly. I'm at this point hitting the delete key before it even gets in front of another pair of eyeballs.
So when you're working with Patterson, James Patterson?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Weirdly enough, I don't read fiction that much, so I'm aware of the people. But even when you talked about Bram Stoker, I had to, in my head, go back. Oh, yeah, that was written, I think, in 1930, Dracula.
Earlier
Is that right?
Earlier
than that?
He died the same day the Titanic sunk.
Wow.
Oh.
So he was the second page headline.
I'm out by 50 years. Anyway. How do you co-write? Because that is something that I've also done a lot of ghost writing, and we'll leave that in the music world. I find it really hard to collaborate. So how do you collaborate?
For me, it's about figuring out what everybody's skill set is. It's almost like having two cooks in the kitchen making breakfast. As long as one of you is making bacon while the other one is making eggs, everything works out. But if you both try to make eggs at the same time, it's a problem. With somebody like Patterson, I mean, he's an extremely smart guy. He's been doing this for a very long time. So we quickly figured out, who was good at what. And we've tried over, the various books, we've tried different ways. With our very first one, it's called Coast to Coast Murders. We literally went back and forth chapter by chapter. And I would try to paint him into some kind of impossible scenario. I'm like, there's no way Jim's going to get out of this. I would send those pages off to him. And 15 minutes later, he'd write a new chapter that he'd send back to me. And not only did he get out of it, but he put me in an even worse position. And we wrote the whole book going back and forth like that. And he had never done that before. He's a notorious outliner. He tends to plot everything out long before he writes that first page. So with the second book, it was called The Noise. He actually sent me an outline and he said, okay, now we're going to try it my way. So I had his framework, his structure, and I wrote the book based on that. And it honestly went a lot smoother, and there was a lot less, stuff cut out, a lot less, fodder on the cutting room floor, because that structure was there. And one of the things that I realized is that I go for a run every day. I run 4.5 miles, and during that time, I tend to think about what I'm going to write the next day. Before, if I wasn't plotting something out ahead of time, I spent that time figuring out, what's going to happen next in the story. But if I have an outline in front of me, I already know what happens next. So now I spend that time trying to figure out how to make what comes next better. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that I learned from working with them. That's one of the reasons. That's one of the reasons why I love working with co-authors, because it takes you in a direction, it takes you out of your comfort zone, and forces you to try something new. And as an author, that helps keep it fresh.
And I love he was open to that in trying sort of the generative approach of, I read a chapter, you respond to it. I absolutely love that.
There's an obscure French term for that. It was a big thing in salons in the 19th century where famous authors would write a chapter. And it happens in music as well. I love that. I'm so fascinated by that process.
We did it once that there's a conference called BoucherCon. And a bunch of big name thriller authors. We were all there, and we did it live in front of an audience while we were all drinking, which was fun. So like when one person would go up, they would write a couple sentences or a paragraph, and another author would go up right behind him, and we just kept going with this story, over the course of an hour. And it's fun because when you're working with somebody else, it just goes in a completely different direction.
Bruce, remember you called me one time and you said, "What is fun for you?" That sounds like fun for me. We always debate, like, is there a universal fun? Obviously, we think it's fairly subjective, but what you just described, like that, I would love to be in that room. I'd love to be participating in that. That sounds really awesome.
Yeah, it was a good time for sure.
Now, as obviously a neurodivergent author, I know that you probably explore topics too that other people maybe don't approach or approach in a different way. I'm really curious about that.
I don't shy away from anything. I tend to read virtually anything I can get my hands on. All across the board. I'll read romance, I'll read sci-fi, I'll read a Western. I don't really care as long as it's a good story. Which you read part of my bio at the beginning. A lot of that gets thrown into my story writing. Honestly, like that frustrated my agents and publishers at the beginning, because the first thing they want to do is be able to put you in a box. They want to label you and say this guy writes this, and they want you to write that over and over again. And I ran into that. My second book, The Fourth Monkey, sold extremely well worldwide, and they wanted that same book but different over and over again. Yeah. And I refused to do that. I purposely seek out new topics, new ideas. So if I see something that I think is gaining ground somewhere, even if it has nothing to do with thrillers, I'll find some way to incorporate it in there, because I think as a reader, seeing something fresh like that, like we all want that. Yeah. And I think it's almost disappearing in the fiction world, especially mass market fiction, just because of what I said. Editors, publishers, they all want you to fit a certain box, and because of that, every thriller author is basically writing the same book at this point. They're using that same formula because that's what everybody feels works.
That'd be so boring to me.
Yeah, they're afraid to step out and try something a little different, and I'm not.
So where do your ideas come from?
Oh, the age-old question.
Yeah.
Nobody really knows. So I've got a document on my phone. I use a program called Simple Note, which is just a note-taking app. And virtually every idea I have is in there somewhere.
Yeah.
So to give you an example of how a book comes together, my last one was called Behind a Closed Door. It's about a husband and wife who have marital trouble. They've been together for about 10 years or so. And we start off with them in the therapist office. I had those two characters in mind for probably 5 or 6 years. They were in my little Simple Note document, Brendan and Abby. Like I knew I wanted to write a book about them, but I wasn't quite sure what that book would be.
Yeah.
Then one night, my wife and I we were sitting around at having dinner, and she does real estate. She had bought a house in Georgia, and it was a fairly large house. And she was her plan was to renovate it, turn it into an Airbnb, but it had 7 bathrooms in it. And just casually, I mentioned this company called Bath Fitters, which I don't know if you have them in Canada, but here in the States, they come in and in one day they just do a complete retrofit of your bathroom. They don't touch the plumbing; it's all cosmetic stuff, but they can redo a bathroom. So we talked about it, like literally just talked about it, and then that night on our phones in our social media feeds, we started seeing ads for Bath Fitters. They started popping up on television and in the commercials, and I started to research that and realized that our phones, in terms of service, we basically allow them to listen to our conversations. Like my phone is listening to us right now; it's grabbing keywords out of our conversation and it's throwing that into a database and it's trying to figure out how to monetize that. That was basically a completely separate idea, but then I took that idea and mashed it together with my two characters, and that kind of became the genesis of the story. So a lot of times, it's multiple pieces that have nothing to do with each other, and when you mix them up a little bit and put them together, that's peanut butter and chocolate tend to taste good.
Yeah. And do you have a sense when it is the right idea to go with the other idea? So I'll sort of preface that a little bit. I am a playwright, so I've written some plays, and sometimes you'll know, like, this is the story, and sometimes ideas feel imposed by me as an author or somebody else as the playwright, in their work. For me, stories write themselves in a way. Like there's a truth that I'm able to channel into, or I'm not.
Yeah, I think the pieces come together and they feel so right. It's almost like an epiphany. You can almost see the light bulb go off above your head.
Yeah.
But then I still have to sit down and I write that first chapter, the first couple chapters to feel it out. Because a lot of times, even though the ideas feel right, you're still not quite there. And then when you put it down on paper, it still doesn't work. So it's usually by the time I get that first or second chapter done, I know for sure, these are the right pieces, or, these two work together, but I'm still missing something else. I need to bring in a third element. But usually 1 or 2 chapters in, I've got that figured out.
When do you know you're finished? And this is I do a lot of teaching of composers, like at the more advanced level. And one of the most difficult questions that you can approach is like, how do you know a piece is finished? So for you, it's like, how do you know? Maybe it's like how long a book should be.
I think, again, I got that structure is embedded in my head. So I know, here's the major twist. Now we're coming up on the climax of the story. And then I usually have 1 or 2 chapters at the very end to kind of wind everything down. So everything just it feels right to me. I mean, I can tell if one of those pieces is going a little too long. I keep my word count in mind. That's very important. I try to shoot for around 80,000 to 120,000 words, somewhere in that sweet spot. And that's always in the back of my head too, because I know that if I get to the midway point and I'm expecting the book to be 80,000 words, if I'm not quite at the halfway point of the story I want to tell, I know something is off. So all those things tend to come together. One of the things that I've learned over the years, I start my day by reading whatever I wrote the previous day, and I edit it and I clean it up. So by the time I get to the end of the story, I really have like a very, very solid first draft. And a lot of times they're actually publishable at that point. Like there's very little that has to be changed. I know the book is done when I'm reading through it, and all I'm doing is moving around commas and punctuation and little things. At that point, it's time to call it a day.
Yeah.
That's a lovely contrast between a lot of creativity I think with writing very especially, is that authors tend to have your narrative structure, your 3 acts, you've got that. I love the word counts also would be very useful. When I do a commission, knowing it has to be 8 minutes or 10 minutes, that's great. Anyway, but also keeping the structure in your head and then maybe a lower level down of making sure that the narrative interplay is working and the characters are all, and you're not doing something silly like you killed a character off in chapter 2 and suddenly they appear again. But also you're constantly also looking at grammar. So it's like very, very structured, and then quite structure but creativity, and then like quite creative at the top. But keeping those things in your head all of the time is really quite fascinating.
Well,
And is
grammar
that
is
an
rules, right?
autistic?
Rules is, yeah, it's a pattern,
Yeah.
For me, I mean, I see the patterns on the page, forget the meaning of the words. I look at the white space and how much, is there versus the actual written words. I use
Interesting.
that to control pacing. If I want to slow things down, you'll see a nice big large block of text. If I want to speed things up, there's a lot of white space on that page, a lot of clipped sentences, a lot of short stuff. Readers have no clue, when they're flipping those pages, they don't realize that the author consciously decided to do that.
Yeah, the
But I know for me
intentionality.
personally, I do.
I
The
love
use
that.
of negative space in writing, that's great.
Uh,
And actually, there are like T.S. Eliot comes to mind straight away. Obviously, E. E. Cummings, but I think there are a large number of authors who probably have maybe not as conscious as you've just described it, but that idea of the words, the space on the page, the words on the page, because it does. You are controlling to a certain extent the rate of reading.
mhm.
Yeah, that's the point. It controls the pacing. All of a sudden, if you want them to flip those pages faster, you basically make it happen by including less words on that page. The reader doesn't realize that that's why it's happening, but they know they're turning those pages faster. It feels like tension is building.
I love that. I'm also like, I'm thinking about all of the ways autistic strengths are such an asset as a writer. Like you've already mentioned, your ability to sort of have a very intimate relationship with your characters. Like you know everything about them. You remember the sequence of all of the events in a way that other people wouldn't. Probably like some of your co-writers maybe don't know it to the same degree that you do. And obviously pattern recognition, grammar. Am I missing anything? What other autistic strengths are an asset?
I think, see, I was diagnosed at 22, so I didn't even know I was autistic
Yeah.
until that point. So I had a big chunk of my life before me that happened, before that diagnosis. Mimicking, I think, is huge. Because my characters, they're obviously all coming out of my head. They do feel like separate individual people to me. Like one character, if they both have to communicate the same thing, two different characters are going to tell you about it in a very different way.
Mhm.
But at the same time, as somebody who has to mimic, behavior of other people when I'm in a public situation, I can just as easily mimic being a doctor. I can mimic being
Mhm.
an astronaut. I can mimic being a police detective, because I've conditioned myself over time to find those. If I'm in a meeting with a police detective, I'm not only listening to the conversation, I'm looking at the way he sits, the way he moves,
Yeah.
the hand gestures, the vocal patterns, all those different things. And as far as I know, that's an autistic thing. I don't believe
Yeah.
a neurotypical person does that, at least not to that extent.
Not that level of
Um,
analysis, I don't think.
no, no, but it's all, obviously very helpful when you're literally making stuff up.
Yeah.
And there's also the routine that you've like to be professionally creative in the way that you are and the way other people in my past, me, has worked. That routine is so important that you have a writing routine. Um, and there's a structure to the day that gives what used to give me very great comfort that I knew what was going on and then, that I had editing in the morning and then a break and then creative writing and things. And for me, it was my breaks were because often I would go and work with a choir or I'd go and do a rehearsal or something. And that also gave me a break of the monotony of the routine in a good way. You talked about hyperfocus in some of your notes. I mean, that's such that ability for us, if we need to, just to do something for 10 or 12 hours and not be too particularly concerned by that, if it's something we love.
Yeah, I mean, for me, there's two different things going on there. So if I don't write every single day, it's almost like there's a voice in the back of my head that just gets louder and louder and louder until I do that. So it's no different than if you put a puzzle in front of me or some other task. Like I have to complete that task. I can't move on to do something else until I finish it. So that's always there, and that's always forced me to get the writing done. So even back when I was in the corporate world, I would find time to do it, and for me, the sporadic portion of that was difficult. Because sometimes I wrote at lunchtime, other times I wrote, after dinner. Sometimes I wrote when I was in the line at the grocery store. I still got it done, but that was difficult, not knowing when I would do it. Today, I've got an extremely structured day. I've been writing full time for 10 years now. Get up at the crack of 7. I go down to my desk. I don't turn the internet on until I get my daily words done because it's a distraction. So I knock out about 2,000 to 3,000 words. I'm usually done with that by about 10:30 or 11. And that's when I flip the switch for the internet. All these emails come in, and the business side of being a writer kind of, breaks in. And then I start to deal with that. I've got an alarm that goes off at 2:45. That's my quitting time. At 2:45, I get up no matter what I'm, have in front of me, and I'm done for the day. Then I go on that run that I mentioned. I come home and spend the rest of the night with my daughter and my wife, and, be the family guy.
I love that. I have to say, as someone with ADHD as well as being autistic, the ADHD part makes the routine part very difficult for me. My desk will never look like yours does behind you, perfectly clean with just the computer. Although I certainly acknowledge the benefits of structure and having times for things, the initiation of those things is really difficult. I wonder. Yeah, and I know, Bruce, you don't have ADHD, right?
No, as far as we know, although there are certain characteristics.
Yeah, I think we all have some executive functioning issues, but you're very good at structure. Like, what advice would you have for writers who maybe aren't as structured?
I think you have to you have to find a way to be structured. If you can't do it organically, then you do need to plot it out on paper. You do need to create that structure, something to hold you accountable. At the very least, I think writing is very much like working out. It's almost like going to the gym. There's a writer muscle. So you need to get your butt in the seat every day and write every single day. And it gets easier as long as you do it every day. If you do it sporadically, only on Saturday or, and then I'll try again on Thursday or whatever. It's no different than going to the gym. You're not going to get fit if you're not regimented about it. So I think you need to do it as often as possible.
Mm-hmm.
JD, I need to recommend a book to you. Just sorry, you've said the word running 3 times now, and again, I'm going to bring up Murakami. He wrote a book on, I think it's actually called On Running, and it's him training to be a marathon runner. And he also now does the same thing, but it's all about exactly what you've just talked about how when he's running, he's writing, or he's doing all that stuff that's not in front of the computer. That's so necessary. But again, it's part of that structure too.
Thinking is writing. Yeah.
I write the books. I spend just as much time writing the books away from my desk as I do at my desk. One of the tricks that I learned very early on is I never get up without knowing what comes next. And a lot of times that means, ending like mid-sentence, like I'll just pick up and I'll go, because one of the things I learned early is a lot of writers will just sit there and they will write until the well runs dry. They'll get a big marathon session, 5,000-6,000 words, but they don't have any clue what's going to happen next in that story because they just laid it all out and they're exhausted by that process. And then the next day they sit down to try and continue the story and they stare at a blank screen for an hour or two before something hits. I purposely get up in the middle of a sentence, in the middle of a paragraph, knowing what's going to come next. My brain for the rest of the day while I'm on that run, while I'm playing with my family, it continues that story. It continues to work it out. So when I sit back down the next day, I hit the ground again running and just keep going and going and going. I don't have that pause. And I think to do this on a regular, as a full-time author, you need to do that or you're going to burn yourself out.
Yeah.
I would need to finish the sentence. Or maybe if it's a paragraph. As you're saying that, I'm feeling slight anxiety, but then I also realize I do the same thing
But see that anxiety that you're talking about, that nagging thing in the back of your head to finish that sentence, that's what causes you to continue to think it through and go beyond not just that sentence, but what happens after that and after that and after that. So I guess that's what I hone in on.
I took a course on how to survive grad school when I was doing my PhD, and we had to set writing goals for the week with the understanding that humans always overplan, forgive yourself. But it became a really good practice at knowing how much you could actually produce, so to speak, in short blocks, 5 days a week, half-hour goals, what you want to do for that time. But I really liked just what you said, that you picked up, you always knew where you were starting the next day. And the benefit that has. And again, you can take that, think about it. Thinking as writing was something that was validated for all of us. You don't think that you are not doing something if you are putting in a lot of thought. Because I think many autistic people, we do so much pre-thinking, and we shouldn't discount that as part of the work.
No, it's definitely part of the process.
Yeah.
Shelley, is it always linear for you? In other words, if you stop mid-sentence and you spend the rest of the day doing the good things, and it sounds like a very I was going to say comfortable. I don't mean it that way, but a good life. You have a good life. It sounds like you have a really good life. When you're thinking about the story, do you have to come back to the same point, or if something important has happened that you think, oh, this needs to be written, this needs to happen 2 chapters away? Do you write a note? Do you write a little bit of that chapter? How do you, or is it always linear because you've got such a good idea? Sorry, go.
I always force myself to write linear, but when one of those ideas happens, it basically goes into the mental outline that I have as this far off thing that I'm going to write, when I get to that point. And in a lot of ways that drives me, particularly if it's something really good. If I come up with a really solid twist that I really, really want to get down on paper, by having it out there, dangling it off in the distance like a carrot, it forces me to get there, which means I'll write the stuff leading up to it even faster.
That's interesting.
If I think with my first or second book, I would have sat down and just wrote that scene just to have it done. But I found that the writing itself is better if I put it off and I just keep telling that story, it in order and do it later.
Do you ever improvise? And here again is this going back to the creativity, and one of the things I do is improvise a lot, but there's always a structure. So if you've got quite a complex narrative, and I am watching the time because we need to finish in 2 minutes. If you've got a really kind of complex narrative and you've got a great twist coming here and you've got this and this needs to lead up to here. When you get to this like great twist, do you sometimes change the language, change the twist because it's developed in a way you didn't think of originally?
I've done that before. For me, right now I've been following Patterson's advice and outlining just about everything related to a book before I start. But when I do pants a novel, which is essentially what we call it if you're making it up as you go, I still have certain waypoints in mind. So a lot of times I have a particular thing that I know needs to happen at the middle, and I've got an ending in mind. And I think by doing that, it gives my subconscious a destination and knows where it needs to get this story to go to finish up. Now, that doesn't mean I can't go off into the weeds as long as I can come back and get onto that main road and get back on track again. But very often I'll start approaching that ending, and whatever I had originally in mind, something totally different will come to play.
Okay.
And I'll change it. So you can't be married to it. In a lot of ways, I let my characters drive the story. Like we talked about, I know them extremely well. I know them as well as I know my best friend. And a lot of times what I want them to do isn't necessarily what they want to do.
Exactly.
And I've learned I can't force them to follow my will. I need to follow theirs. So, if they take me off in a different direction, I tend to listen to them.
Yeah.
I love that we're talking about these absolutely imaginary things, people, events that we cannot change what they're doing.
Some things just feel right, Bruce. It's magical. Like I called it channeling, because you can tell when your characters are doing what they're meant to be doing. Now, I have one last question, JD, because I know you have to run. When do you know the title?
Ooh.
Oh,
That's so hard for me.
that's a tough one. Yeah, for me, writing the book to me is the easiest part.
Right.
Then creating the text that goes on the back of the book, summarizing that novel in 200 words is very difficult.
Me too.
Creating a tagline for the book is even harder. So now you got one sentence describing it, and then the title is probably the worst part.
It's agonizing.
So before I start a book, though, I approach it in the opposite direction. Before I start, I've always got my title, I've always got the tagline, and I've always got those 200 words describing what the book is about. The title and the tagline, they go on a little strip of paper, and they're on you can't see it, but they're on my monitor on my desk, so that I'm reminded of it literally every time I look up. And having the 200 words describing what that book is about keeps me focused and keeps me on track the whole time. Now, that being said, a lot of times that title will change 4 times, 5 times, 6 times, until we land on something right. And there's a lot of people in my world today that, they influence that. My agents are involved, my editors are involved, film and TV people sometimes, so we all tend to work together on that kind of thing.
Very cool. Okay, well, we won't take up any more of your time, but this has really been delightful. Thanks for coming by, chatting with us. I'm so excited to hear that one of your how does it pronounce? Dracula?
Dracula.
Dracula. It's going to be made into a movie, so we'll have to check that out when it's out. Is there anything you'd like to promote or mention before we say goodbye?
No, I've always got something going on. If you visit jdbarker.com, hop on my newsletter. That's probably the easiest way to find out what's coming down the pipeline. I've got a bunch of books coming out over the next couple of months.
Amazing.
But that's the best place to hear about them. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, pleasure
I'd love
chatting.
to have you back to talk about because what we didn't talk about is your advocacy, and I think that's another hour conversation. So
yeah, maybe we'll have you next
back.
season.
I will come back anytime.
Would love that. You take care. Have a great day, JD.
Thank you, JD.
All right, take care.
Thank
Bye.
you, everybody else. Bye. Autistic.